Hi everyone. So as Brian mentioned, I'm from the MTO, Ministry of Transportation in Ontario, where we have many ongoing initiatives when it comes to drugs and drug. And when I say initiatives, I mean broadly the research, marketing, and policy developments. One you may have heard of more is the full implementation of our drug transitions. But my goal today is to tell you about one very specific project that we are embarking on. I'm going to provide some context and background information, work my way there. And as I work my way there, I will touch upon some of the other work that's going on right now in the MTO. Okay. So every year, Ontario publishes a road safety annual report to monitor collision numbers, amongst other indicators. Our most recent data from 2013 show that 64 of the 518 total traffic fatalities involved at least one driver who had used drugs. So this is about 12% of all fatalities. So let's look from a different perspective. Let's look at data from the same year, but from coroner reports rather than police reports, and for the number of drivers killed rather than the number of all road users killed. So our 2013 coroner data indicates that 39% of drivers killed tested positive for drugs, either alone or drugs in combination with alcohol. So a year later, we worked with a consultant to conduct a roadside survey. This is something that Dr. Ashford here touched on before. So this is a random sample of drivers from the traffic stream, and this study found that 10.5% of sample drivers were drug positive. So together, these three numbers give us some idea of the prevalence as well as the impact of drugs on Ontario's roads. So now that we have a snapshot of the drug situation in Ontario, on Ontario's roads, let's talk about how this is currently tackled at roadside. So in terms of detecting drug presence, saliva testing is probably the most effective, the least invasive, and the simplest method that we have available. So the technology is certainly available. However, there's currently no standards for its routine use, at least on Ontario's roads. So about a year and a half ago, the MTO has partnered with the Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences, as well as the RCMP, to evaluate 3 commercially available roadside oral fluid screening devices for their ability to detect the presence of drugs in their saliva. I believe Doug Barron will be talking about this a little bit later, but I do want to emphasize that the test results here will be used to inform a set of standards that we're hoping will be adopted into the criminal law of Canada. So while that's all going on, in the meantime, the MTO, we're also working with national partners to develop a plan for police services to pilot test these oral fluid devices at the roadside. So now, while we have these oral fluid devices that can detect drug presence, we also have an existing test battery to detect impairment. So this is a standardized field sobriety test. Although it was developed primarily to detect alcohol impairment, it has been used in Canada since 2008 for both drugs and alcohol impairment. And one of the initiatives that we're currently doing at the MTO is partnering with a consultant to look for ways to enhance this SFST, particularly for detecting impairment by drugs. So despite having these methods to detect drug presence and drug impairment at roadside, presence and impairment is not a one-to-one relationship. And so what I mean by that is that a drug may be present at low levels without any impairing effects. Now on the other hand, you can have some concentrations of some drugs decrease very rapidly in the body while the impairing effects persist. So for example, in the context of marijuana, the THC concentrations fall pretty quickly within 30 minutes. However, the impairment lasts 2 to 4 hours later. And again, as Dr. Ashbridge alluded to, there's additional factors that complicate this presence to impairment relationship, such as the method of consumption or whether that person is a frequent user or a recreational user. So presence and impairment not having a one-to-one relationship is important here because it sets a stage for a research project that we are currently doing and that I will tell you about. So before I dive into that, I do want to unpack this presence-impairment relationship a little bit more, and particularly in reference to marijuana. So again, it has been mentioned that there's typically 3 types of studies that we look at. There's laboratory studies, there's simulator studies, and then there's epidemiology studies. So in terms of the lab and simulator studies, they have found impairing effects of marijuana. So particularly, some of the laboratory studies have found that marijuana impairs attention, it impairs reaction time, it impairs distance perception. Likewise, for simulator studies, there's been impairment effects noted in things like speed variability, or car following distances, or lane positioning and weaving. So, while the results from these lab and simulator studies are relatively straightforward, the epidemiology studies are a little bit more complicated to interpret. So the effect estimates in the epidemiology literature as a whole is pretty mixed. So if you ask any given researcher or look at any given study, they will say, I'm fairly confident that this is what's going on, but if you look at the evidence base as a whole, there is some discrepancy. And so what I want to emphasize here is that it's not that there's disagreement as to whether there is an effect. The disagreement is more so the magnitude of the effect. So what is the exact size of this increased risk? So most of the reasons why this epidemiology literature as a whole is hard to interpret, why there's some conflicting messages, is that they use different methods. So I'm going to highlight a few of these methodological challenges that the epidemiology literature currently faces. So the first one is difference in biological samples. So different studies use different biological samples to assess whether marijuana is present. So just as an example, typically studies that use urine as a sample don't tend to show an effect, but I think it is also commonly believed that urine isn't the best estimate. Oral fluid is probably a better estimate because it provides indication of recent use. Blood is also a pretty good estimate, although it doesn't exactly indicate the impairment effects that's in the brain. So the point is here, if you have some studies that use one biological sample and another study that uses another biological sample to indicate the presence of marijuana, it's not really surprising that their effect estimates don't agree. I think what's critically important here is that studies should ideally be consistent within themselves in the type of biological sample that they use. So typically epidemiology studies look at cases, which is a subset of the population that has the outcome. So in this case, these are people who've crashed. And then you look at the controls. These are the people who do not have the outcome. They have not crashed. And you look at their marijuana exposure. And if in cases you're using blood, let's say, and in the controls you're using a totally different biological sample, that in itself is a limitation to those studies. So that's one reason why the evidence is a little bit mixed right now. Another reason is that there's confounding factors. So marijuana users share demographic characteristics that are similar to other high-risk driving groups, such as being young and being male. And if you don't control for these factors, they actually confuse a relationship between marijuana and crash risk quite a bit. So again, if we're talking about the literature base as a whole, you have some studies that don't adjust for these factors, some studies that adjust for some of the factors, and some studies say they adjust for many of them, but perhaps there's still some residual confounding left. So again, another methodological challenge that we're facing. Third reason that I'll talk about is something called misclassification of explosion. And this simply says that it's indicating marijuana presence when there maybe isn't one. So one example is that some studies may count this inactive component of marijuana in addition to the actual psychoactive component when classifying a group of drivers as being exposed to marijuana. And so again, this is potentially a source of bias and can also make some studies incomparable if they're classifying the exposure of marijuana differently from other studies. Last reason I'll highlight is the use of specific populations in studies. So ideally, the groups that you're comparing, the cases and the controls, they should be comparable. They should come from the same study population. Sometimes cases are very specific populations, such as those treated for substance abuse issues. In other scenarios, the controls come from a different time period. So again, that's another limitation. So no study is without limitations, and my goal here in the last 4 bullets isn't to criticize existing research, but it's more so to highlight some of the challenges that we collectively face as we're trying to navigate all this evidence on marijuana and collisions. So in the midst of all this, the MTO, we are currently conducting our own version of a case control study to derive a collision risk estimate from marijuana. Now, in the last slide, I've highlighted 4 bullets that provide some indication of some of the methodological challenges that have been met so far. So I guess the question is, what makes our study different? In other words, why are we attempting to do the same thing if there are challenges in the literature? I think there's 2 possible reasons. One is that people have different usage patterns from place to place. So take a hypothetical example. Let's say we have jurisdiction A. And in jurisdiction A, there may be more medical marijuana users than recreational users. In jurisdiction B, this is maybe the reverse. And it has been speculated that medical marijuana users may be differently affected because they have tolerance or because they have baseline levels in their system. So that's one potential reason why we want to derive a jurisdictional specific estimate. A second reason is perhaps most important, and this is going back to the idea of these confounding factors that confuse a relationship. So a lot of studies, when they do control for these confounding factors, they look at things like age and sex. There are other factors that can confuse the relationship, and this is what I'm collectively calling the driver profile. So these are things like the individual driver's collision history, the individual driver's conviction history. This will give us an indication that maybe they are just by nature of higher risk to be involved in collisions aside from any marijuana. And because we're doing this study in-house and using Ontario data, we have this information. So we have everyone who has a driver's license in Ontario, we have their lifetime records of collisions and convictions up from, I think, back to 1988. So this information is at our disposal, and this is something that we can use when we're deriving this jurisdiction-specific estimate. Okay, so in terms of how we're doing this, so recall from the earlier slide. So the very first slide I presented two statistics, 2013 coroner data and 2014 roadside survey data. So now if you look at these statistics, I think an eyeball analysis would suggest that if drugs are more present in dead drivers than in alive drivers, then perhaps drugs increase fatal crashes. That's the eyeball analysis, and that's sort of the hypothesis that we want to test. But we want to test it by refining the data so that we have a much more robust analysis. And essentially what I'm trying to say from this slide is that we will be conducting a case control study with our cases being the dead drivers from the coroner data, and our control population being the people in the roadside survey data. So in terms of how we're going to do this. So the first thing is we're going to update the 2013 coroner data to 2014. So I think that's pretty straightforward. Previously, I talked about cases and controls being from a different study population. So we want to avoid that. So one way to start is to make sure they're from the same year. Other thing we want to do is adjust for confounders. So age and sex is the typical confounders I mentioned. The other thing I mentioned is that we have access to this driver profile information, the collision history, the conviction history. And that's something that we want to take into account. Now, we can't do that directly in the study because our control population, the roadside survey data, that's anonymized, so we can't look into their collision history and their conviction history. But what we can do is take the coroner data cases and look at all those fatally injured drivers and to see whether THC differs significantly in your driver profile. So that's a companion study that we can do that can help inform this larger case control study. Another thing that we intend to do is to adjust these thresholds to reflect recent usage. So one of the methodological challenges I pointed out before is that when you use different biological samples, there's different thresholds to detect whether the drug is present in your blood. So with both the coroner data as well as the roadside survey data, we have information not only on drug presence, but also on the drug concentration. And so we can adjust these thresholds so that we are making the two samples as comparable as can be. And another thing we want to do is to isolate the marijuana-only cases. So if we go back to the statistics in the top left of the slide, the coroner data is 39% of drivers killed tested positive for drugs, either alone or with alcohol. So we want to isolate that to marijuana only. Likewise, in the 2014 roadside data, 10% are drug positive. Again, we want to isolate that only to marijuana cases. And lastly, we're planning to match for time of day, day of the week. So this goes back to the what I mentioned before about making sure our cases and controls are from the same study population. The roadside survey, I believe, was done between June and October in 5 different regions of the province, Wednesday to Saturday nights from 9 to 3 a.m. I believe. So we want to make sure we match the coroner data to the time of day of week that is in the roadside survey data. So in terms of next steps for this particular project, we plan on continuing to monitor the literature for emerging evidence on the relationship between marijuana and collision risk. And we want to continue with this in-house collision risk estimates, planning to have some results by year end. So this study that I just explained to you is still in its infancy. So the bad news here is I don't have any results to present. But I think the good news here is that any feedback that you provide, whether when it comes to methods or implications, that can help inform the study as we go forward. So I'll just leave it at that, and here's my contact information if you want to talk further.
Okay, thank you.